Help give kids an extra life by donating today to help sick and injured children. Link in the description and pinned comment below.
This is your crew chief. Your snowball is in a rolling start. Good luck. Happy holidays.
Well, it's time for another Patreon-sponsored video, this time requested by 101% wonderful patron TrueMay. If I had a nickel for every time I got a Patreon request to cover an arcade game in December, I'd have 2 nickels. This meme will never die. And it's time once again to talk about Sega's expansive arcade library. Now, I've covered a few Sega arcade games already, but I've barely scratched with a toothpick the surface of what they've done in the coin-op space. In fact, I'm surprised I haven't gotten around to talking about one of their most famous racing games. That's right, we're talking about Daytona USA, one of the most successful arcade games of all time, racing or otherwise, and named after one of the most famous real-life stock car races in the world. This title is a staple in Sega's arcade legacy. And today, we're gonna shift into high gear and talk about why this game is so famous.
Let's just say the meme-worthy main theme is only part of the reason.
So the story starts in September of 1992, when Sega partnered with GE Aerospace to create their newest arcade hardware, the Model 2. The arcade board was a follow-up to the Model 1, which was Sega's first 3D polygonal arcade hardware, which had first appeared in arcades earlier that year with Virtua Racing. When the hardware for the Model 2 was in development, GEA showed off its capabilities with a tape simulating Daytona International Speedway. The demo showed what the arcade board was capable of: texture filtering, anti-aliasing, and displaying upwards of 300,000 polygons per second at 60 FPS, among other things. This was impressive stuff at the time. So with the new hardware, the task came to decide on how to unleash it upon the world. Virtua Racing, based on Formula 1 racing, was popular in Japan and Europe, but Tom Pettit, the president of Sega's American arcade division, suggested a title based on NASCAR racing, and despite some pushback from Europe, the concept was approved, although they only negotiated the license with the Speedway and not NASCAR themselves in order to cut costs. Now, there was another popular stock car racing game in the arcades at the time. Can you guess what that game was?
It's Ridge Racer! Ridge Racer!
So yeah, stiff competition. And they wanted to surpass it. The daunting task fell to Sega's AM2 development team, headed by the legendary Yu Suzuki. The project was headed by director Toshihiro Nagoshi, who wanted the game to be more funky entertainment than the sim-heavy Ridge Racer. Members of the team watched races and racing movies and studied other racing games to help get a feel for what they wanted from the game. The game ultimately saw a limited release in Japan in 1993, with a full release in March of 1994 in both the US and Japan, with a worldwide release the next month. So let's pop a quarter in the slot and start this baby up!
But before we do that, you know what time it is.
You know this theme? The soundtrack for this game is mimetic, but more on that later. Daytona is, naturally, a racing game, taking several cues from Virtua Racing before it, though instead of an F1 car, you drive a stock car called the Hornet. At least, that's the only car available in the arcade version. The Saturn port gave us additional cars to play as. You can choose one of 3 courses in the arcade version, and you have the option between automatic and manual transmission. The manual has a slightly higher top speed, so if you're good at driving stick, well, you have a chance to claim a slight advantage. There are 3 courses, like I said. 3-7 Speedway is the easiest with 8 laps in a 40-car field, Dinosaur Canyon is the advanced course with 4 laps and 20 cars, and Seaside Street Galaxy is the expert course with 30 cars but only 2 laps. The rules are the same as your basic arcade racer. Complete the course in the best time possible and try to beat everyone else. You have an additional timer running, which you extend by reaching checkpoints and completing a lap. So the idea is standard in its rules, but what makes it so exciting is what you can do. From basic stuff like jump starts to techniques like drifting, which normally isn't possible with stock cars but was added to make it feel more arcadey, there's plenty of ways to claim the checkered flag. There are also 4 different views which you can select with the press of a button, an element which was imported from Virtua Racing. Another interesting thing about this game is adaptive difficulty. How well you perform in the first lap will be used to alter the difficulty in the remaining laps. The more skilled you are, the more likely the CPU racers will try to block your path. This is also a factor in multiplayer. There is rubber banding in the multiplayer races to keep everyone in the pack. speaking of multiplayer, let's talk about the presentation. Not just in the game, but in the cabinet itself. For one thing, up to 8 cabinets could be linked together for multiplayer, and if you could get that many people racing at once, it could be really exciting. Some of these linked cabinets also included cameras that were connected to closed-circuit TV to show the players' reactions on a separate screen. Though more realistically, you had a better chance of seeing a 2-player cabinet. As was expected for racing games in the arcade, the typical setup was a sit-down machine with the standard driving setup including an H-type shifter for manual players. The steering wheel even included force feedback for that extra little bit of immersion, making you feel every bump and rattle. The game itself had some killer presentation as well. Like I've mentioned before, the Model 2 is a big step up from the Model 1, capable of displaying 300,000 texture-mapped polygons per second, nearly double that of the Model 1, making for more detailed models. Since the Model 2 is capable of texture mapping, a greater level of surface detail was possible. As expected with new technology, the AM2 team tried a lot of things to get it right, including adding objects like a fossil and a clipper ship at various locations. Well, at least there was no tomato in the code. If you know, you know. As for the sound design, the roar of the engines and the sound of every collision is on point, and the contact with the pit crew is honestly a nice touch. As for the music, yeah, there's no denying the music is super catchy. The composer was Takenobu Mitsuyoshi, who recorded all the vocals himself to save time. In order to get the vocals onto the hardware, the songs were sampled onto a Yamaha sound chip and then reconstructed by varying when the tracks would play. Each theme has its own vibe. Let's Go Away, the game's main theme, is a mix of rock and funk, while Sky High leans more jazz fusion. There's actually a hidden track based on Hotel California by the Eagles.
And there is your fun fact for the day.
Daytona USA was a big hit for Sega. In Japan, it was in the top 10 highest grossing arcade games of 1994 and the highest grossing of 1995. It saw similar success in North America, being in the top 3 highest grossing cabinets in both 94 and 95. Even beyond those years, there are those that consider it to be one of the most successful arcade games of all time, even though exact figures are hard to find. Gamers and critics alike hail this game as a classic, thanks to its tight gameplay, its stellar presentation, and its collision physics. You'd be surprised what you can do in this game. Naturally, with the success of Daytona in the arcades, home ports were inevitable, and the most well-known of these ports is probably the Saturn version, which was released in 1995. Now, there are some key differences. First off, the Saturn version didn't include multiplayer, which is honestly baffling unless Sega figured the Saturn couldn't handle split screen in a game like this. However, there was an additional Saturn mode which turned off the countdown timer and included new courses and more cars to play from. There were also Endurance and Grand Prix modes included in the Saturn port, both of which required an additional element of realism: pit stops. Yes, pit stops were present in the arcade version, but they were rarely needed there, if at all. In the new modes in the Saturn port, however, the effect of damage on performance was much more noticeable. While the gameplay was as tight as the arcade version, the Saturn port did fall short in 2 main areas: graphics and performance. Some reviewers found issues with the graphical detail and frame rate found in the port, and when you compare it to the arcade original, yeah, the downgrade is quite significant. There were also some updated versions of the game, including Champion Circuit Edition released in 1996 for the Saturn, Daytona 2001 for the Dreamcast, which included new courses and online multiplayer, an enhanced remake called Sega Racing Classic released in arcades in 2010, and an enhanced version for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 in 2012, which included online multiplayer. And hey, remember what I said about success? Yeah, it brings sequels. But these sequels are more obscure than the original. I wonder how many people remember Daytona USA 2 Battle on the Edge. I didn't know it existed until I was doing research on the original, but here we are. This game was released in arcades in the middle of 1998, this time on Sega's Model 3 hardware, which, at the time of its release, was the most powerful arcade board in existence. If you thought the jump from Model 1 to Model 2 was impressive, take a look at the graphics for Daytona 2. Now, as with the first Daytona, there were 3 tracks to pick from, but this time there were also 3 cars to pick from as well, each one being easier or harder than the other 2. What's more, the cabinet operator could put the cabinet into Grand Prix or Endurance mode to make things more challenging. The gameplay was largely unchanged, with the exception of the addition of a staple racing technique: drafting. You know how you can ride the slipstream of other racers and slingshot past them? Yeah, satisfying as hell. And the multiplayer? How does 16-player racing sound?
Yeah, pretty exciting stuff, isn't it?
A few months later, an enhanced Power Edition was released, featuring more aggressive computer AI, a challenge mode which combined the 3 tracks together, and several aesthetic changes. It's this version of the game which is included as a side game under the name of Sega Racing Classic 2 in the recently released Like a Dragon Gaiden, The Man Who Erased His Name. Now keep in mind, this is the game's first home release. There was going to be a Dreamcast version as well, but that got silently cancelled. Well, we had to wait 25 years for a port, but hey, better late than never, right? There was also a third game released in the series called Daytona Championship USA, or Daytona USA 3, released in arcades in 2016, but, well, aside from the aesthetics of the tracks, the layout of the tracks is the same as the original. Yeah, it might as well be labeled a remake, and not even a particularly good-looking one either. Funny thing, Sega actually posted the whole game online by accident. It's since been taken down, but you'll probably find it somewhere else. Nothing vanishes from the internet completely.
Time extension!
Wow, it's a time extension! Do you know what that means? That's right, we have another Sega racing game to cover!
Turns out that Daytona wasn't the only racing series that got its start on the Model 2. In that respect, there was also Sega Rally Championship, released in fall of 1994 and directed by Kenji Sasaki, a former Namco employee who, ironically enough, was known for his work on Ridge Racer. You know, Daytona's big competitor. Similar to how Daytona focused on stock car racing and virtual racing focused on F1, Sega Rally Championship, true to its name, focused on rally racing, a subject which Sasaki-san felt was taboo in the Japanese gaming sphere. The unique selling point of the game was the inclusion of different environments which affected the handling of your car. There were 3 to choose from, as well as an unlockable 4th car with manual and automatic transmission for all of the cars. There were 3 courses to start, those being Desert, Forest, and Mountain, and as you completed each course, your position would carry over into the next race. This meant that the point was not to finish each race in first, but to claim the checkered flag at the end of the final course. In fact, finishing the first course in first place was impossible. However, if you finished the final course in first place, you'd unlock an extra course called Lakeside. Now there's an incentive to reach the top. Of course, regardless of where you finished, you'll still be greeted with the legendary meme.
Game over, yeah!
Imagine other games having that theme for game overs.
Game over, yeah! Game over, yeah!
Interestingly enough, the Saturn version could barely be called a port. Instead, it was built pretty much from the ground up, according to producer Tetsuya Mizuguchi. The graphics of the arcade version were merely referenced, and the Sega Graphics Library OS used in other Saturn arcade conversions wasn't used here because it was still in development at the time. Another fun fact, the North American version of the Saturn port was actually rushed to market to make the holiday season. By the time the Japanese and European versions came out, a bunch of fixes were already in place, making them better versions. Holding yourself to bullcrap deadlines never ends well. Both the arcade and Saturn versions of the game were very well received and sold really well, with critics praising the visuals and game feel. So of course, this game had sequels as well. Sega Rally 2, developed on the Model 3 by Sega's AM Annex team, came out in arcades in 1998 and was released on the Dreamcast the following year. Building upon the previous game, Sega Rally 2 added new vehicles from more manufacturers, new environments for courses including snow and island tracks, and multiple circuits for each environment type. Given what the Model 3 hardware did for Daytona's sequel, it should be no surprise that Sega Rally 2 also looked great for the era. The detail in the cars and environments was on point. While not generally as well received as the original, the game still received generally high marks from critics for its presentation and challenge factor. Now here things get a little interesting. Sega Rally 2006 wasn't released in arcades, but instead came out in Japan and Asia for the PS2. Something similar would be said for Sega Rally Revo, which released in 2007 in most regions for PC, PS3, Xbox 360, and PSP, with the Japanese release in January the following year. Here's the really interesting bit. Sega Rally 3, which released in arcades later that year, is actually a condensed version of Sega Rally Revo. Yeah, the arcade version is the port. The two are actually being developed at the same time, and a version for PSN and Xbox Live Arcade was released in 2011 as Sega Rally Online Arcade, bringing everything full circle. The arcade game was developed on Sega's Europa R arcade system and included World Championship Mode, which is the classic-style multi-course rally, Quick Play, which is a single race, and Classic Mode, a reproduction of the original game's desert track. While not as highly regarded as 1 or 2, it's still viewed generally favorably. So there you have it. 2 Sega racing arcade franchises born on their Model 2 hardware, one for stock cars, the other for rally racing, but both of them have an important part in Sega's vast arcade legacy. It's honestly impressive what Sega's hardware was able to pull off in that era of gaming. All that detail at a smooth 60 frames per second with that level of control is honestly amazing for the early to mid-90s. With Daytona being one of the highest grossing arcade games of all time, and the original Sega Rally Championship also proving a massive hit, it's no surprise that they're remembered as fondly as they are. Nailing both presentation and game feel, they've left a mark that few racing games have been able to match. Want further proof? The car from Daytona is in the Saturn game Fighters Megamix, not as a cameo, but as a playable fighter. After so many cars being bashed apart in fighting game bonus stages, I guess one car had to stand up for its brethren.
And hey, Sega's recent Game Awards announcement said that they're bringing back several of their iconic franchises. And while Daytona specifically wasn't on the list, they did say "and more." Given that Daytona is celebrating the 30th anniversary of its wide release next year, Sega's got a chance to do something special. Of course, the best feature they could add is for Sega of America not to punish their employees for wanting to unionize. I'm the Quarter Guy, and until next time,
Game over, yeah!
30 years ago, a future was created where an archaeologist discovered a certain capsule containing a robot with unlimited potential. That robot would become the basis for a new generation of robots. But when those robots started to go out of control, that robot would reluctantly risk his life to fight them. That being said, the capsule he was found in wasn't the only capsule involved in his mission. Next time, Top 10 Mega Man X armors. It's game time! Hey everyone, QG here. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, and share the video around. Feel free to check out my Twitter and my Twitch streams, and consider supporting me through Patreon and donating to my Extra Life campaign to support Children's Wisconsin. Thanks for watching.